I'm so glad to be here today, and I must say that I was very, very impressed by the kinds of insights that came from our contribution to the reading or rereading of Obert Mpofu's book. I found it very, very exciting in many ways, because generally what happens in Zimbabwe is that somebody writes something, it is reviewed, and then people move on. But what I'm really impressed by here is that we now have this conversation where a lot of young people, particularly young scholars, are also responding to the accepted truths about phenomena in Zimbabwe, right? And Obert Mpofu wrote his book about the struggle for independence in Zimbabwe, and he wrote about the struggle in the form of a memoir. And what has happened is that a lot of the younger scholars have actually interrogated his experience, his recall, and his analysis of what happened. And I found it very, very enlightening when all of them were also presenting their views. And when I also read the book, and I was commenting on what Obert Mpofu had written about. And I think that a lot of what we are going to discuss today has to do with the anti-colonial struggle, the neo-colonial forces that erode the gains made through African nationalist struggles, the movements, the values, the philosophies, the contradictions in Africa too. Because again, as we know, our continent has its internal contradictions relating to governance, relating to age, relating to preference, and relating to struggles relating to, our ethnic understanding of each other, our race, our class positioning, and who gets heard and who doesn't get heard. And I think that the need to democratize our economies has also been a very, very important issue. And it continues to be an agenda item. And I found that in the book and in the presentations, including mine, we were asking all these kinds of questions. What happens to liberation? What happens to the generation of knowledge? Who generates knowledge? Who's supposed to consume it? And how do we consume the knowledge? And the critiquing of knowledge as it is produced. I think these are very, very important questions. And in terms of the memoir by Obert Mpofu and the reactions to it, as you can see, history is also personal. It's not something that can distance out there. But I think people are also very, very important in the roles they play. And I think it is very, very critical for us to begin to understand that the biographies are critical in telling us about positioning of different players and our own positioning as we read. Because as readers, we are not neutral either. Because we're reading and we're coming from particular positions. And for me, especially as Richard has said, I would also have taken a very feminist position on the readings of both the literature by Mpofu, his experience of the war, and I'm sure if a female guerrilla wrote about the war, I would have a very different take on the war from a woman's perspective, or even from a young woman's perspective, because I've spoken to a lot of young women, and that perspective of the war is very different from that of younger men or older men. And of course, older women would also have a different perspective of that struggle. And I think that's another issue that we need to deal with. Because there's been very little writing by women and their participation in our liberation. And also their participation and take on the post-liberation agenda of Zimbabwe. Because as we know that biographies focus on the individuals, but individuals are also very important. And I think that if you look at the issue of our President Mugabe and the ways in which he left, I also feel very strongly that there's a big void because he never wrote his memoirs. I still would like to know what he was thinking and what he was doing and why. And I think that that's one of the big voids that I can identify in our history and in the biographical genre that we are taking. Because the biographies are also very important because they tend to tell us more about people beyond what we see in the public domain. Because we are not always public individuals, we're also very private. And our private selves can be very different from our public selves in many situations. And I think that this is a binary that we need to take into account. And as I was reading this memoir by Mpofu, I was absolutely amazed that he was able to do such a job, especially having crossed from Zipra to Zanla, or from Zapo to ZANU. And I think that there were many issues. When I read Obert's book, Obert Mpofu's book, I call him Obert, but he needed to discuss and address the problems of the post-colonial state that he has participated in terms of governance and his political home, and all the issues that have to do with the post-independence era. Because there are many chapters in our post-colonial history that we still have to interrogate. There's the Kukuraundi, right, which is another issue which was supposed to be a disturbance, but there was quite a lot going on there. And politically, I think that there is still quite a lot to be written about that. And if we look at all these issues, I feel that it is critical for us to keep writing, especially younger scholars, because I found that a lot of the comments of the younger scholars were very critical for me. And they were very interesting because they also have a different standpoint from people my age, for example, because I was a student here from 1976 to 1979, and now I'm sort of evolving into a grandmother in the scholarly world. And it's a new position for me, a youngish grandmother, but a grandmother nevertheless, because I'd love to claim grandmotherhood, Why? Because grandmotherhood also gives you a lot of authority. So you sort of appropriate the grandmotherhood sometimes before it's even given to you. But I think it's very critical for us to begin to interrogate a lot of our own standpoints. And my standpoint, I think, has been very, very interesting. What I find very difficult is the fact that Robert Mugabe's memoirs are missing, right? He was such a huge influence on our country, but he never wrote a word. And that is something that I find very difficult. How are we going to write his experience during his absence now? I think that is an issue that maybe LAN needs to address, because we need to reclaim Robert Mugabe, regardless of what we feel about him. But he did have an impact on our lives. And I'm sure that in the same spirit that the young scholars wrote about Obert's memory and the national question, I think that there's a need to write about Robert Mugabe and the nation of Zimbabwe. And from the perspective of younger scholars, preferably, because I think it's very, very critical. And so while we're discussing Obert Mpofu's book, it is very fortunate that Obert Mpofu is still around and he can read and understand and dialogue about what younger scholars are saying about him, and about Zapu, and about ZANU, and about what happened during the liberation phase. I think this is the most ideal situation where there's a generational debate, there's a generational discussion, and there are three generations that can have a discussion about the same issue. So Obed Mpofu did us all a favor. He wrote his memoirs while he could. And we can now react to his memoirs and interrogate them, and we can make our own understandings very clear, and he can benefit from what we're saying just as much as we benefited from what he said. And I think this is the way we should go, because I find it very difficult when somebody's memoirs are published after they've died, right? Or something, they leave some kind of person who's written a few things and says, I knew him like this and that, I knew her like this and that. So I find that this has been a very, very enlightening exercise. And I don't want to take Laura Mandara's time as well, because I'm coming from an older generation of scholars. And I think younger generations of scholars also need to be heard, because they also have a very different take on independence and what has happened after. So in that respect, I hope that you have benefited as much as I have from having this generational narrative. And what is good is that we have all taken part in the narrative. While Obed Mpofu is there, younger scholars are there, and we can dialogue. And he can hear what people are saying, and they can also interrogate what he's saying. And that, I think, is the way things should be. The interaction is necessary, and it must continue. And I think we have to applaud LAN for the good job that they've done to give younger scholars a podium and a voice in this kind of incarnation, in our political and economic incarnation in Zimbabwe. Thank you very much for listening. I think I will stop here.